Welcome to the Lit Up Lightworker Podcast, bringing you fun and soulful interviews with spiritual teachers with the aim of tuning you in and lighting you up. You can access all episodes of the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. And be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more videos and interviews all about finding and following your life purpose. My name is George Lizos. I'm a spiritual teacher, intuitive, the author of Be the Guru, the co-creator of Elemental Healing, and the author of the #1 best-selling Lightworkers Gotta Work. And today I have with me Emma Lowe. Emma is a New York City-based writer and editor. She is the sustainability editor at Mind, Body, Green and the author of the Spirit Almanac, a guide to self-care rituals divided by the seasons. She graduated from Duke University with a degree in environmental science and is fascinated by how people interact with nature. She loves being outside, taking photos, and finding creative ways to write about sustainability and spirituality. Emma, welcome to the Lit Up Lightworker Podcast.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
I am so excited to chat about your book because it deals with such an interesting topic, self-care, but you approach it from a historical perspective of how old, like ancient societies have studied self-care, and you've associated it with seasons. And I gotta tell you, I've just come back from a 7-day trip in Greece where I did what I call temple hopping. I toured different ancient temples and I observed how the ancient cities were built. And what I found out was that self-care was built into the structure and the lifestyle of the cities. Every single ancient city had their baths, where they would go and take care of themselves. The spirituality was so embedded into the structure of the city. All the cities had multiple temples to various gods and goddesses. Every single house in the center of the house had an altar to Hestia, goddess Hestia, or the Roman Vesta, which is all about coming together as a family and just centering before you start your day. So it's amazing how ancient self-care really is. So before we dive into the whole topic, what was your intention with writing this book? What is your background, first of all? How was your spiritual journey to finding out about ancient spiritual care, and what was your intention with writing the Spirit Almanac?
Yeah. So first of all, I love that story and think it's so interesting, what you were saying about how it really was kind of embedded in culture back then in a different way than it is today. And I think it's interesting to consider too, kind of the reason that people needed self-care back then was very different than the reasons, we kind of turned for it today with, all the influx of technology and, all the different kind of things vying for our attention these days. But anyway, so Spirit Almanac was something that I worked on. It was published in 2018. So leading up to that point, I, as you mentioned, am still the sustainability editor at Mind, Body, Green, which is, for people who aren't familiar, it's a health and wellness website based in New York. And it takes a very holistic, kind of zoomed out view on self-care. On wellness. So we kind of focus on, your traditional, fitness and eating healthy and all that good stuff. But we also talk a lot about, helping out the planet and how we can't really be healthy if the planet is sick. So that's kind of what most of my coverage deals with. And as, I've been working with MBG for about 5 years now. And as that time has gone along, I've really started to notice these crossovers between sustainability and spirituality. And just the idea that, when people start to act in a way that really, helps them kind of build their spiritual, reservoir, so to speak, and kind of, they look within, they tend to connect with nature more. And I thought that was really interesting, just this idea that spirituality can kind of be a gateway to living more sustainably. So that was one kind of seed that planted the idea for this book. And I think another thing that really inspired me was just meeting all of the incredible kind of leaders and thought leaders who we interview at Mind, Body, Green, and learning about kind of their self-care practices and how they really turn to them as, a source of strength and power. And it was just super interesting to learn about, all the different ways that people practice self-care in their personal lives, because it is so different for everyone. So I was inspired to kind of put together a resource with my dear friend and co-author Lindsay Kellner, just to kind of share some of the ways that people practice self-care today and kind of find some of the roots of some of the self-care practices that have become popular in the wellness world. So it's a very fun journey. And like you mentioned, we split it up by the seasons, just keeping up with this idea that I think that to really look within, you kind of have to look outside and, start to connect with the rhythms of the earth and just build them into your routine, even though it's not super intuitive in today's day and age. That's I'm like sitting here in an apartment building in the middle of Manhattan. So yeah, that was kind of the inspiration of the whole project.
Well, first of all, let me say, I love Mind Body Green, and I know many of my listeners do. I'm like an avid reader of the blogs and all the information that comes out there. And I know one of my friends was also featured there, Emma Mildon. And there was
I love Emma.
I love Emma as well. She wrote the foreword for my book, and I was so grateful.
I love it. She's in our book too. She does a little crystal ritual.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's amazing what you mentioned, how connecting to the earth and nature is so interconnected with self-care. And coming from my own perspective, I also used to work for a spiritual company. I worked for Hay House in the UK for 3 years, while at the same time building my spiritual business part-time. And I reached a point where I was so exhausted, so overwhelmed, because I was working a 9-to-5 job, then working on my business until midnight. Weekends were dedicated to my business. So I reached a point of where I was completely fatigued. I had eczema all over my skin. I gained 15 kilos, and I started getting depressed. And it was only after reconnecting with nature that I just literally went to a retreat for 7 days out in nature in a magical city called Glastonbury in the UK, where I allowed myself to just be nurtured by the elementals in nature, that I had the epiphany that was quit your job, move back to Cyprus and go self-employed. And here I am 2 years later, the eczema is gone. I've lost 15 pounds and I couldn't feel happier. So it really is interconnected, self-care with nature. And as you say in your book, it goes way back. So I want to ask the question, what is the history of self-care?
Yeah, so it's a tough question because I don't think there's really one answer, but people have always had different ways of taking care of themselves. And I think that, back in the day, it was a lot more community focused, which is interesting. Like you mentioned, people would kind of gather at these communal baths and, set up altars in their home and maybe approach them with their family members. And I think it's become a lot more insular in today's day and age, which, it's not necessarily, doesn't have to be a bad thing, but I think it makes it a little trickier because it's really, it's not as built into society as it used to be. I think that, the term self-care is also, it's a relatively recent, advancement. And I think that, a lot of times it gets a little bit commercialized and, used to sell products. But I don't think it has to be that way at all. And that was kind of our intention with the book, was to really share some free or inexpensive and accessible tools that you can use just to check in with yourself, in today's kind of crazy day and age.
It is definitely a new term. So how would you define it? Let's get the basics down before we go deeper.
Yeah, so me personally, I would define it as self-care is a way to look within, or the practice of looking within in a world that kind of begs you to look elsewhere. So I think it's just really checking in with yourself and, tuning out a lot of the noise that we're faced with and just kind of asking what do I really want and what do I really need at this moment?
God, so important, because we're so inundated with so much information coming from so many different places, and it's intensified over the last few decades. So I'm curious, why did we have this need to create the term self-care? Since it's such a new term, that means something changed that created the need to have that, a need that maybe did not exist in the ancient times or even earlier than that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it might, just have been a response to the fact that we kind of need to recognize this as a kind of tangible thing in order to really incorporate it into society. And I think that, as we kind of got further away from those communal, kind of community-based self-care rituals, we needed to create them for ourselves, and we needed kind of the language to share how we're doing that. That would be my guess, but it is a really interesting question.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense given like all that's going on in the world. We got away from ourselves, so it becomes so essential to just create a term to help us reconnect. Now, how can we prioritize self-care in this fast-moving world that we live in? What are some practices that we can use to, even to the busiest people, that they can find some time to take care of themselves?
Yeah, so another, interesting question. I think it can be really difficult, especially if you're someone who is a caretaker, or, you are so used to putting other people before yourselves. It's hard to kind of, carve out that time. One thing that I have found really helpful, and we kind of touch on in the book, and I'm sure you've discussed at length on this podcast, is just the idea of like the natural cycles of the moon as kind of being like a timekeeper and a reminder. So like me personally, I know I don't have the most rigorous, on track, sometimes I won't, do the proper self-care for a while, but I've always found that recognizing like the new and full moon, that's kind of almost my reminder to be like, okay, I'm just going to check in. I'm going to see what's gone down these last 2 weeks, and I'm going to kind of rejigger and see what I'm needing right now. So it's almost like, again, using nature as kind of a natural timekeeper to remind you to come back to yourself. I think it's really beautiful and much easier to practice way of doing self-care. And that's not to say, like the full moon was 2 days ago and I still have not done my full moon ritual, but just, just letting it be a reminder. You don't have to do it that day, but, just using that energy while it's still potent.
And it's so easy because like we walk outside every single night, so we see the moon. So it's an easy reminder to just check in the new moon and the full moon. And just coming back to my own like Greek pagan tradition, I was reading about the history of the ancient Greeks and what rituals they did for the new moon and the full moon, which are quite different from what we do now. Like right now, we usually associate them with new moon intentions and manifestation. Mm-hmm. They did something similar, but not quite. So the new moon was in honor of, was it Apollo? I think it's Apollo and Artemis. So it was the time of the month. First of all, it was the beginning of their month. So their months were according to the moon cycle. So new moon was called Numenia, and it was the beginning of the month. And then the full moon was the middle of the month. So in the beginning of the month, the beginning of the new moon, basically, they would declutter their house, clear out their stuff, go through the different altars in the house and just replenish their offerings to the gods. And again, it's all part of self-care for the house, for themselves, and getting some time to check in. It's amazing how these rituals have lasted over time. And of course, along with the moon cycles, in the book, you talk about seasons. So what is the general idea, the rule of thumb to direct ourselves through the seasons and combine self-love activities while doing so?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The way I actually kind of like to think about it is I think about each season like a phase of the moon. So I think winter would be the full moon. It's kind of, or I'm sorry, the new moon. It's kind of that time where we can look within, set goals, and it's just a very like inward facing time of the year. And then as we're entering spring right now, I think it is a waxing moon. So it's kind of, time to build that momentum, start to, get outside a bit more, start to manifest some more things, and, put your kind of goals into action and start to lay the groundwork. Summer is the full moon, and it's really a time to, I think it's the most active time of the year. You're out there, you're socializing, you're kind of bringing those dreams and those goals to life. And then fall would be the waning moon, where we're kind of, starting to gather the fruits of our labor, so to speak. It's harvest season, and you're kind of, preparing to go back inward for winter. So, there are lots of different ways to approach the year, and obviously, it's not going to be that formulaic every year, but I think it's interesting to think about that way, just because it also kind of gives you a framework to, slow down a little bit in these colder months. I think that's, what our bodies really innately want to do, and that's not always what society tells us to do. So I think it's a nice reminder.
Yeah, and it's a great idea as well to it's a great way basically to realize that we're part of nature, because for so long they've told us that we control nature, that we dominate on nature, but really we are part of it. Our bodies are so interconnected with the cycles of nature. So it's a great way to connect. Could you share with us some practical self-care tools that our listeners can use, even today, actually, to just turn within and reconnect with their inner selves?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, there are so many, and that's kind of the fun part about it is you can experiment and see which ones really work for you and you find easier to keep up with. And it doesn't really necessarily feel like a chore. It's something you're excited to do and you want to do at the end of every day. So some of the ones we discuss in the book are, breathwork rituals. I think, kind of finding a breath that's right for you can be really helpful, especially for people who have trouble meditating. I found that it's like a really good gateway to that. So, that kind of gets at the idea too, that even like taking a few minutes to just like take some deep and controlled breaths can be self-care. And it's really incredible, like how helpful that can be, just taking a few minutes to just check in with yourself, slow down and be like, okay, I'm here. This is my body. This is me. Let's go. So I think that's, a super simple, good one. Of course, journaling, I'm a writer, so I love journaling, and that can take on a lot of different forms. You can either reflect on the day. If you had a really frustrating day, it can be helpful to just get some of those worries and frustrations out on paper. It can be great for, around the full moon time, planning and kind of dreaming, and you can maybe visualize what you'd like to, bring to life this next moon phase and then write that down. I personally love to pull tarot cards. I find it, yeah, especially, during like chaotic times or when you kind of feel like you're at a crossroads. It's just nice because it gives you like an external cue. I'll pull a card and I'll be like, that represents this. I really had not thought of that. Let me think that through. And it's kind of just I like to think of my tarot cards as like my like impartial friend who just like gives me some new ideas. Yeah, they're fun. So that's great. I know I was just flipping through our spring section of the book to get some ideas for the coming season. And spring can be a really great time to refresh your altar, especially with like if you bring in some sort of greenery from the outdoors. We talked about that and the idea that green is kind of a good color for fertility and like transformation and kind of setting up those themes that we just discussed.
I love that you said that because I've just added some basil on my altar right behind me, like today.
Yeah, there you go. You're already ahead of the game. So yeah, I mean, there's so many, fun things that we can do, and it really is just about finding kind of your flavor ritual, so to speak.
Oh my God, I love it. And it's just so easy to like take some time to come into our center. As you said, like breathing is just so simple and yet so powerful. Because sometimes in the spiritual community, I don't know about you, but we have all these complicated tools and processes, mantras and mudras and yoga and everything. And many people feel just overwhelmed and they feel not good enough. And therefore they just choose to be idle and not do anything. Whereas it's just so easy to just connect with our spirituality and ourselves just with a simple breath, for example. Oh my goodness, Emma, thank you so much for all the tools you've shared with us. Where can people get the book and get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. So the book is available, wherever books are sold. It's on Amazon. Check indie booksellers near you to see if they sell them. It's called The Spirit Almanac, and it's by myself and Lindsay Kellner. And my website is just my name. I'm Loewe, Loewe, and then my Instagram is EMMLOEWE. And you can find my writing at My Body Green.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming onto the show. I'll post all the links and the information in the show notes. Wishing you a lovely rest of your day.
Great. Thanks, George.